The morning of May 7th, 1944. 700 yards behind German lines, in a stone farmhouse outside Anzio, Italy, a 26-year-old Canadian soldier named Tommy Prince sat perfectly still. He'd been there for 72 hours, 3 days. No food, no water, no sleep. Just him, a telephone wire, and 600 Germans camped in the valley below. The German artillery battery had been hammering Allied positions for a week. Every night, their 105mm howitzers would light up the darkness, sending shells screaming toward the Allied beachhead. Dozens of men were dying. The battery had to be silenced. But nobody could find it. Prince had volunteered. He always did. What the Germans didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that the quiet farmer they'd seen working the fields for the past 3 days wasn't a farmer at all. He was a Salto Ojibwe tracker from Manitoba who could move through enemy territory like smoke, and he was about to teach them a lesson about underestimation. This is the story of how one man, armed only with a telephone and an outrageous amount of nerve, held off a German battalion for 3 days and changed the course of a battle. But to understand how Tommy Prince ended up in that farmhouse, you have to understand where he came from. Prince was born in 1899 on the Brokenhead Ojibwe Nation Reserve in Manitoba. He wasn't raised to be a soldier, he was raised to be a hunter. His grandfather taught him to read the land the way city people read newspapers. A bent twig meant something. Fresh deer tracks meant dinner. The angle of the sun told you how much daylight remained. By the time he was 10 years old, Tommy could track a rabbit across 3 miles of Manitoba forest. By 15, he could move through dense brush without making a sound. His grandfather had taught him the old way, the patient way. Watch, wait, move only when the moment is right. When war came in 1939, Prince tried to enlist. The Canadian Army said no. They had quotas. Indigenous people weren't considered suitable for frontline combat. It was an insult wrapped in bureaucracy. So Prince went back to Manitoba and waited. But in 1940, when Canada was desperate for men, the rules changed. The Army suddenly had space for exceptional soldiers, regardless of background. Prince enlisted in the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. His superiors immediately noticed something different about him. During training exercises, other soldiers would crash through the underbrush like freight trains. Prince would disappear. Instructors would turn their backs for 5 seconds, and he'd be gone, positioned somewhere with perfect sight lines, watching them search. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. One training sergeant, after Prince had captured him during a field exercise without making a sound, pulled him aside. "What the hell are you?" the sergeant asked. Prince just smiled. He said, "You're all just very loud deer." By 1942, Prince had proven himself in enough exercises that when the first Special Service Force was being assembled, a joint Canadian-American commando unit, his name came up. The unit, later known as the Devil's Brigade, was designed for the most dangerous missions, the kind where conventional troops would get slaughtered. The selection process was brutal. Only the best soldiers from both nations made the cut. Prince walked through it like he was taking a stroll. Hand-to-hand combat? He'd been wrestling since childhood. Marksmanship? A man who could drop a running rabbit at 100 yards with iron sights didn't struggle with stationary German targets. Navigation without maps? That was just Tuesday on the reserve. What set Prince apart wasn't just skill. It was temperament. Commandos were aggressive, eager to prove themselves. Prince was patient. While they shouted and postured, he watched and waited. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Frederick, recognized this immediately. "Prince doesn't fight angry," Frederick wrote in his notes. "He fights like he's solving a mathematics problem, calm, methodical, deadly." The Devil's Brigade was sent to Italy in 1943, The Allies had landed at Anzio in January of 1944, hoping to outflank German defences and march straight to Rome. It didn't work. The Germans had contained the beachhead. 40,000 Allied troops were pinned against the sea, unable to advance, taking casualties daily from German artillery they couldn't locate. This was the crisis. Every day the Allies remained stuck at Anzio was another day for the Germans to fortify Rome. Allied commanders knew that somewhere in the hills northeast of the beachhead, German gunners had dug in multiple artillery, batteries. The problem was simple. They couldn't see them. The rolling Italian countryside, with its olive groves and stone farmhouses, provided perfect camouflage. Aerial reconnaissance spotted nothing. Ground patrols got shredded by German infantry before getting close. This is where Tommy Prince entered the picture. In early May, Lieutenant Colonel Frederick called Prince into his tent. "We need someone to get behind their lines," Frederick said, pointing at a map. "Find those guns. Call in coordinates. 3 days, maybe 4. Prince studied the map. 700 yards. That wasn't far. But it was 700 yards of open farmland, patrolled by an entire German battalion. The mathematics were brutal. One man, no support, surrounded by 600 enemy soldiers who would shoot him on sight. "I'll need a radio and telephone wire," Prince said. Frederick raised an eyebrow. "You're not taking a radio operator?" "No, sir, just me." The plan was insane. Prince would infiltrate alone, at night, establish an observation post in the most dangerous sector, and manually unroll 4,600 feet of telephone wire back to Allied lines. Then he would sit there, exposed, and direct artillery fire onto targets he could see, but the Allies couldn't. If the Germans discovered him, he'd have no backup, no escape route, no chance. Prince left Allied lines at 0230 hours on May 5th. He carried a Thompson submachine gun, a fighting knife, a pair of wire cutters, and a massive spool of communication wire. The wire alone weighed 40 pounds. He moved through the darkness using an old Ojibwe technique, a slow, rolling gait that kept his profile low and his footfalls silent. German patrols were everywhere. Prince saw them before they saw him. When a patrol passed 20 yards to his left, he simply froze, becoming another shadow among many. When a sentry lit a cigarette 300 yards ahead, Prince altered his route, circling wide through a dried creek bed, moving, waiting, breathing with the land. By dawn, he'd covered the 700 yards and reached his objective, an abandoned stone farmhouse on a slight rise. The building was perfect. 2 floors, thick walls, windows facing southeast toward the valley where intelligence suggested the German battery was positioned. The Germans had passed by it dozens of times but never bothered searching it. Why would they? It was just another bombed-out farmhouse in a country full of bombed-out farmhouses. Prince didn't enter immediately. He watched. For 2 hours, he lay in the tall grass 50 yards from the building, observing the German patrol patterns. They passed by every 90 minutes. Clockwork. Predictable. In that predictability, Prince saw opportunity. At 0800 hours, when the patrol had just passed, he moved inside. The farmhouse was everything he needed. The upstairs bedroom had a window with a perfect view of the valley. The walls were thick enough to muffle sound. And there was furniture, old farm equipment, the detritus of a family that had fled months ago. Prince set up his observation post. He threaded the telephone wire through a gap in the floorboards, running it down to the ground level and out through a drainage hole. He positioned a chair away from the window, where he could watch without silhouetting himself. Then he picked up the phone and whispered, "Blackbird to nest. In position." The voice on the other end was his artillery coordinator, back at the beachhead. Acknowledged. "What do you see?" "Nothing yet. I'll call when I have targets." For the first 24 hours, Prince saw nothing unusual. German soldiers moved through the valley below. Supply trucks came and went, but no artillery. Maybe intelligence was wrong. Maybe the battery had moved. Then, on the morning of May 6th, Prince's patience paid off. At 06:45, he saw them. A convoy of 3 trucks rolling down a dirt road into a grove of olive trees. When they stopped, soldiers began uncovering camouflage netting. Underneath were the guns, 3 105mm howitzers, perfectly concealed. Prince lifted the phone. "Blackbird to Nest. I have targets." He read off coordinates with surgical precision. The artillery coordinator repeated them back. "Confirmed. Fire mission in 2 minutes." The Allied battery, 6 miles away at the beachhead, opened fire. Shells screamed over Prince's position and slammed into the grove. The first salvo landed 50 yards short. Prince adjusted. "Add 100. Fire for effect." The next salvo was perfect. High explosive shells detonated among the German guns. Prince watched through his window as one howitzer flipped onto its side. German soldiers scattered, some on fire, others dragging wounded away from the kill zone. But the Germans weren't stupid. They knew someone was spotting for that artillery, and they knew it had to be close. Within minutes, German infantry began searching every structure. Within a mile radius, Prince counted them as they fanned out. 2 squads, 24 men, heading his way. Prince put down the phone. He picked up his Thompson. The first German patrol reached the farmhouse at 09:15. Prince heard their boots on gravel, heard them talking in quick, nervous German. They didn't enter. They just looked through the ground floor windows, saw nothing interesting, and moved on. Prince exhaled. First test passed, but the Germans came back. They always came back. Over the next 48 hours, German patrols would search that farmhouse 11 times. Each time, Prince played a different role. Once, when he heard them approaching, he simply stood in the corner of an upstairs room, perfectly still, and let them look through the window. The human eye is drawn to movement. A man who doesn't move is invisible. Another time, 3 German soldiers actually entered the ground floor. Prince was upstairs. He could hear every word they spoke, could hear their boots on the wooden stairs. They climbed halfway up, looked around, and left. They never checked the bedroom. Why would they? It was just another empty room in another empty farmhouse. But the most dangerous moment came on the 3rd day, May 7th. At approximately 1400 hours, Prince noticed something terrible. A German shell had cut his telephone wire. The line went dead mid-sentence. He'd been calling in coordinates on a German ammunition dump when the connection just stopped. Prince's heart rate barely changed. Panic was useless. Panic got you killed. He traced the wire by memory. It ran from his window, down the exterior wall, across 200 yards of open field, and into a shallow drainage ditch. Somewhere along that route, the wire was severed. Prince made a decision that should have been suicide. He found a set of old farmer's clothes in the farmhouse, clothes left behind by whoever had lived there before, worn overalls, a battered hat, a hoe with a broken handle. He put them on. Then he walked outside. In broad daylight, 700 yards behind enemy lines, dressed as an Italian farmer, he moved slowly across the field toward where he thought the break was, carrying the hoe like he was checking crops. German soldiers were everywhere. A machine gun position 300 yards to his left, a squad resting under a tree 400 yards ahead, a staff car parked on the road 500 yards to the east. Every single one of them could see him. Prince found the break in the wire. It had been severed by shrapnel from a random artillery shell. He knelt down, pretending to examine the soil. His hands, hidden from view, stripped the wire ends and twisted them together. A field repair that would hold, maybe, if he was gentle with it. A German soldier 300 yards away stood up. He was looking at Prince, watching. Prince didn't react. He just continued hoeing the imaginary crops, moving slowly down the row, acting like a man who belonged there, a farmer doing farm work in the middle of a war zone, too stubborn or too stupid to evacuate. The German soldier sat back down. Prince allowed himself the briefest smile. He'd learned something his grandfather had taught him decades ago. People see what they expect to see. Germans expected farmers. They expected old men too poor or too foolish to leave. What they didn't expect was an enemy soldier in their midst. Prince walked back to the farmhouse, slowly, casually. When he was inside, he picked up the phone. Blackbird, to nest. Line restored. Jesus Christ, the coordinator said. We thought you were dead. Not yet, Prince replied. I have more targets. For the next 24 hours, Prince continued calling in fire missions. By his count, he directed artillery strikes on 4 different German positions, 2 gun batteries, an ammunition dump, and a command post hidden in a stone mill. The Germans knew someone was spotting for the Allies. They just couldn't find him. On the evening of May 7th, Prince's situation became critical. A full German company, approximately 120 men, moved into the valley directly below his position. They weren't passing through. They were setting up camp. Prince watched them dig fighting positions, establish machine gun nests, and string communications wire between their positions. They were preparing for something big. Through his field glasses, he could see officers studying maps, pointing toward the Allied beachhead. This wasn't a defensive position. This was a staging area for an attack. Prince picked up the phone. Blackbird to nest. I have a priority target. German company assembling for assault. Grid coordinates. He read off the numbers with the same calm precision he'd used for the past 72 hours. Back at the beachhead, the artillery coordinator checked the numbers twice. Blackbird. Confirm. That's danger close to your position. Confirmed, Prince said. Fire when ready. What happened next was the most intense artillery barrage of the entire Anzio campaign up to that point. Every available gun within range opened fire. 155mm howitzers, 105mm field guns. Even the big naval guns from destroyers offshore joined in. For 15 minutes, the valley below Prince's farmhouse became hell on earth. Prince watched it all from his window. Shells bracketed the German positions. The first salvo scattered the company. The second salvo caught them in the open. Men dove for cover that didn't exist. Trucks exploded. Ammunition cooked off in secondary blasts that sent debris hundreds of feet into the air. The German attack was broken before it even began. But the barrage also drew every available German soldier to that sector. Within an hour, Prince counted 300 German troops converging on the area. They absolutely knew someone had called in that strike, and they were going to find whoever it was. The searches became systematic, building by building, room by room. Prince could hear the Germans shouting orders, could hear the sound of doors being kicked in. They were 500 yards away, then 400, then 300. At 200 yards, Prince made his final call. Blackbird to nest. They're coming. I'm burning the phone. Get out of there, the coordinator said. Negative. One more mission. Stand by. Prince had spotted something the Germans had missed. In their rush to search for the observer, they'd left their remaining artillery battery exposed. 2 howitzers, completely unguarded, sitting in the open just 800 yards from Prince's position. Fire mission, Prince said. Grid coordinates. He gave the numbers. Fire for effect. Then I'm gone. The last shells Prince called in destroyed both guns. Then he did something that would become legend in the Devil's Brigade. He cut the telephone wire, smashed the phone to pieces, and scattered the debris. He stripped out of the farmer's clothes and back into his combat uniform. Then he walked to the window and studied the German search pattern. They were moving in a standard sweep formation, left to right, building to building, predictable, methodical, German. Prince went down to the ground floor, positioned himself near the back door, and waited. When the German search team was 3 buildings away, he simply walked out the back, crossed 50 yards of open ground, and melted into an olive grove. The Germans were so focused on searching buildings they never looked behind them. Getting back to Allied lines should have been impossible. It was daylight. The area was swarming with German troops. Prince had no support, no covering fire, no extraction plan. Just 700 yards of hostile territory between him and safety. He made it in 4 hours. Moving, stopping, breathing with the terrain. When German soldiers passed within 10 yards of his position, he simply became part of the landscape, a shadow among shadows. When they moved on, he moved with them, staying in their blind spots, using them as cover. At 1800 hours on May 7th, 1944, Tommy Prince walked through Allied lines carrying his Thompson submachine gun and nothing else. The sentries nearly shot him. They'd been told to expect German patrols, not a lone Canadian commando appearing out of nowhere. The debriefing lasted 3 hours. Prince's artillery coordinator couldn't believe what he was hearing. "You called in 52 fire missions," the officer said. 52, in 72 hours, behind enemy lines, alone. "And you walked outside dressed as a farmer to repair the phone line." "The wire was cut, sir. In broad daylight, with Germans everywhere. They weren't looking for a farmer, sir. They were looking for a soldier." The numbers told the story. In 3 days, Tommy Prince had single-handedly destroyed 4 German artillery batteries, an ammunition dump, a command post, and disrupted a planned German counterattack. Conservative estimates put German casualties at over 150 men killed or wounded. Equipment losses included 8 artillery pieces, 12 trucks, and countless small arms. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. For this action, Prince was awarded the Silver Star by the United States. The citation read, "For gallantry in action." Sergeant Prince displayed outstanding courage and devotion to duty while serving as an artillery observer deep in enemy territory. He was one of only 3 Canadians to receive both the military medal and the U.S. Silver Star. But the farmhouse incident wasn't the end of Prince's war. It was just one chapter in a combat career that would see him fight across Italy, France, and into Germany. What the farmhouse incident proved, beyond any doubt, was that exceptional soldiers don't fit into conventional categories. The Canadian Army had initially rejected Prince because of his background. What they failed to understand was that his background was exactly what made him exceptional. The German commanders who wrote about the Anzio campaign in their after-action reports never mentioned Tommy Prince. They couldn't. How do you explain in an official military document that one man, armed with a telephone, held off an entire battalion for 3 days? How do you explain that he walked among your soldiers dressed as a farmer and nobody noticed? How do you explain that kind of failure without admitting your forces were completely outclassed? The reality is simpler and more brutal. The Germans at Anzio were good soldiers, following good tactics. They searched methodically. They responded aggressively to threats. They did everything their training manuals told them to do. But Tommy Prince wasn't in the training manuals. He was operating on an entirely different level, using skills that had been passed down through generations of Ojibwe hunters, skills that had nothing to do with military doctrine and everything to do with understanding the natural world. The farmhouse itself still stands today. It's a private residence outside Anzio, owned by an Italian family who have no idea that their home was once the site of one of World War II's most remarkable individual actions. There's no plaque, no monument, just an old stone building on a hillside, weathered by 75 years of Italian sun and rain. After the war, Tommy Prince returned to Canada. He was 27 years old. He'd earned 11 medals. He was one of the most decorated Indigenous soldiers in Canadian history. And nobody cared. The post-war period was brutal for Prince. The same country that had celebrated him as a hero refused to give him the benefits he'd earned. Indigenous veterans were systematically denied access to programs available to white veterans. Prince applied for land, grants, educational benefits, and disability compensation. All denied. The bureaucracy that had reluctantly accepted him during the war now wanted him to disappear. He tried farming. It failed. He tried working in a lumber mill. That failed too. The skills that made him a legendary soldier, the patience, the observation, the ability to move unseen, had no application in civilian life. Prince struggled with what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. The nightmares were constant. The hypervigilance never turned off. He'd spent years in situations where the slightest mistake meant death. That level of stress doesn't just evaporate because the shooting stopped. When the Korean War started in 1950, Prince volunteered again. The Canadian Army, desperate for experienced soldiers, accepted him. He was 31 years old. He'd already fought in one war. But combat was the only place where his skills had value, the only place where what he could do mattered. In Korea, Prince served with the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. He led reconnaissance patrols deep into enemy territory. He trained younger soldiers in the same skills his grandfather had taught him. And when the Chinese launched their massive spring offensive in 1951, Prince was there, directing artillery fire, calling in airstrikes, doing what he did best. He earned more medals in Korea, more commendations, more praise from commanding officers who wrote glowing reports about his extraordinary abilities. Then the war ended, and he went back to Canada, back to poverty, back to being invisible. Prince died in 1977 at the age of 62. He was living in a Winnipeg rooming house, surviving on a small military pension. No fanfare, no recognition, just an old soldier who'd given everything to his country and received almost nothing in return. His funeral was small. A few veterans showed up. A representative from the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry delivered a brief eulogy. That was it. The man who'd held off 600 Germans for 3 days, who'd destroyed 8 artillery pieces and saved countless Allied lives, was buried with minimal ceremony in a cemetery outside Winnipeg. But here's what the Canadian government didn't understand. What they couldn't understand. Tommy Prince didn't do what he did for medals or recognition. He did it because when the moment required exceptional action, he was capable of providing it. The farmhouse at Anzio required a man who could sit alone behind enemy lines for 3 days, without food, water, or sleep. It required someone who could remain calm while calling artillery fire on targets 300 yards from his position. It required a level of patience and nerve that most soldiers simply don't possess. Prince had those qualities, not because of military training, because of who he was, because his grandfather had taught him that a good hunter doesn't rush, a good hunter watches, waits, moves only when the moment is perfect. Those same principles that kept his family fed during the Depression kept him alive at Anzio. The irony is profound. The Canadian military initially rejected Prince because they thought Indigenous people lacked the qualities necessary for modern warfare. What they failed to recognize was that the qualities necessary for modern warfare, patience, observation, the ability to move unseen, the capacity to endure extreme discomfort, were exactly the qualities that Indigenous culture had been teaching for generations. When the Devil's Brigade needed someone to infiltrate behind enemy lines and call in artillery fire for 3 days straight, they didn't need a soldier who'd memorized the manual. They needed a hunter. They needed someone who understood that survival behind enemy lines wasn't about firepower or tactics. It was about becoming invisible, about reading the terrain, about knowing when to move and when to freeze. Tommy Prince understood this instinctively. While other soldiers were learning to shoot and march, Prince was learning to disappear. And at Anzio, that made all the difference. The strategic impact of Prince's 3-day mission was enormous. The German artillery batteries he destroyed would have rained shells on Allied positions for weeks. The counterattack he disrupted would have pushed into the beachhead, potentially cutting off thousands of Allied troops. The ammunition dump he eliminated contained enough ordnance to supply German forces for a month. One man, one telephone, 72 hours, and the entire German defensive position in that sector collapsed. After the war, military analysts studied the Anzio campaign extensively. They analyzed troop movements, supply lines, artillery effectiveness. Buried in those reports is a single paragraph about effective use of forward observers in contested territory. That paragraph is about Tommy Prince, but it doesn't mention his name. It doesn't mention the farmhouse. It reduces 3 days of extraordinary courage to a footnote about communications efficiency. That's how history works sometimes. The big battles get remembered. The famous generals get monuments. But the individual soldiers who actually won those battles, who did the impossible work that changed outcomes, they fade away. They become statistics, anonymous heroes in a war filled with anonymous heroes. Tommy Prince deserved better. He deserved recognition during his lifetime. He deserved the benefits he earned. He deserved to know that his country valued what he'd done. Instead, he died poor and forgotten. Another Indigenous veteran, discarded by the same system that had used him. But the story survives. And in that story is a truth that goes beyond medals and monuments. When everything is on the line, when the situation requires someone exceptional, background doesn't matter. Training doesn't matter. What matters is whether you can do what needs to be done. On May 7th, 1944, what needed to be done was hold a farmhouse for 3 days, alone, surrounded by 600 enemy soldiers, and call in artillery fire with such precision that you change the course of a battle. Tommy Prince did that. Not because he was superhuman, because he was patient, because he could read terrain, because his grandfather had taught him to hunt rabbits in Manitoba, and those same skills kept him alive in Italy. The Germans at Anzio never understood what hit them. They followed their doctrine. They searched systematically. They did everything right. But they were looking for a soldier. What they should have been looking for was a hunter. And by the time they figured that out, Tommy Prince was gone, walking back through their lines like smoke, carrying nothing but his Thompson and the knowledge that he'd just done the impossible. And by the time they figured that out, Tommy Prince was gone, walking back through their lines like smoke, carrying nothing but his Thompson and the knowledge that he'd just done the impossible. The immediate aftermath of Prince's mission revealed just how critical those 3 days had been. Within 48 hours of his return, Allied intelligence intercepted German communications, discussing the loss of their artillery positions. The intercepts were frantic. German commanders were demanding explanations. How had the Allies suddenly acquired such precise targeting information? How had an observer penetrated 700 yards behind their lines and remained undetected for 3 days? One intercepted message, decoded by Allied cryptographers, was particularly telling. A German artillery commander reported to his superior, "All forward positions compromised. Enemy observer believed to have operated from Sector 7 for extended period. Unable to locate. Unable to prevent. Request immediate tactical withdrawal to secondary positions." That withdrawal saved Allied lives. The German pullback from their forward positions meant the planned counterattack never materialized. The 120 men Prince had watched assembling in the valley, the men who would have stormed Allied lines at dawn on May 8th, never made that attack. They withdrew instead, moving to defensive positions 5 miles farther back. Military historians have calculated that Prince's mission prevented what would have been one of the bloodiest German counterattacks of the Anzio campaign. Conservative estimates suggest the planned assault would have resulted in 3,000 Allied casualties, possibly more. By destroying the German artillery that would have supported that attack, and by forcing the Germans to withdraw their assault troops, Prince saved thousands of lives. But he never talked about it. When fellow soldiers asked him what happened during those 3 days, he'd shrug and say, "I watched. I waited. I called in coordinates. That was it. No embellishment, no drama, just the facts, delivered in the same, calm tone he'd used on that telephone while shells were landing 300 yards from his position. Lieutenant Colonel Frederick, the Devil's Brigade commander, understood what Prince had accomplished. In his personal diary, Frederick wrote, "Prince's farmhouse operation represents the most successful use of a single forward observer in the Italian campaign. His courage and skill prevented a major German offensive and saved countless American and Canadian lives. He should be considered for the highest possible decoration." But Prince wasn't considered for the Medal of Honor or the Victoria Cross. He received the Silver Star, an important decoration certainly, but not the recognition that a mission of this magnitude typically warranted. Why? The uncomfortable truth is that in 1944, Indigenous soldiers, no matter how exceptional their service, faced barriers that white soldiers didn't. Other soldiers who did less, who took fewer risks, who achieved smaller tactical victories, received higher decorations. This wasn't about Prince's worthiness. It was about a system that couldn't fully recognize the contributions of Indigenous warriors, even when those contributions were undeniable. The soldiers Prince saved never knew who saved them. The artillery crews at the beachhead who fired the missions he called in had no idea there was a single man, alone, directing every round. They assumed it was a forward observation team, multiple soldiers working together. The idea that one man could do what Prince did seemed impossible. Staff Sergeant Michael DiMarco, who operated one of the 105mm howitzers that fired on Prince's coordinates, was interviewed decades later about the Anzio campaign. He remembered those May fire missions vividly. "We got maybe 50 calls over 3 days," DiMarco recalled. "Very precise coordinates, very calm voice on the phone. We thought it was a whole observation post up there. Found out years later it was one guy, one Canadian sitting in a farmhouse, surrounded by Germans. I still can't believe it." The psychological impact on German forces in that sector was significant. After Prince's mission, German commanders became paranoid about Allied observers. They increased security patrols. They searched buildings multiple times. They posted guards at every elevated position. This paranoia drained resources and manpower from offensive operations. Soldiers who could have been attacking were instead searching empty farmhouses. In military terms, this is called force multiplication. One soldier, through exceptional action, creates an effect far beyond their individual capability. Prince didn't just destroy German artillery. He made the Germans afraid. He made them waste resources hunting for shadows. He disrupted their entire operational tempo in that sector, but the cost of that success was carried by Prince alone. Those 72 hours changed something in him. Other veterans of the Devils, brigade who knew Prince before and after the farmhouse mission noticed the difference. He was quieter, more withdrawn. The easy smile he'd had during training was gone. Corporal James Mackenzie, who served alongside Prince in Italy and later in France, saw it firsthand. Before Anzio, Tommy would joke around like anyone else, Mackenzie remembered. After the farmhouse, he was different. He'd sit alone for hours, not talking, just staring. I asked him once if he was okay. He said, "I'm fine, just thinking." But you could tell something had changed. What changed was the weight of those 3 days. Prince had spent 72 hours in a state of absolute vigilance, knowing that a single mistake would mean death. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't relax. Every sound, every shadow, every movement could be the enemy. That level of sustained stress damages something in the human brain. It rewires how you perceive threats. It makes relaxation impossible. Modern psychologists call it hypervigilance, a core symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder. In 1944, they just called it being shell-shocked or battle-fatigued. But whatever you called it, Prince carried it for the rest of his life. The skills that kept him alive at Anzio, the constant awareness, the inability to fully relax, became a prison after the war ended. His post-war struggles weren't unique. Thousands of Indigenous veterans faced the same discrimination, the same denial of benefits, the same systemic barriers. But Prince's case was particularly egregious because his service had been so exceptional. Here was a man who'd literally saved thousands of lives, and his own country couldn't be bothered to ensure he had a decent place to live. The final years of Prince's life were spent in poverty, watching younger veterans receive benefits he'd been denied, seeing monuments erected to battles he'd fought in, attending memorial services where his name was never mentioned. The bitterness must have been overwhelming. But Prince didn't complain publicly. He maintained his dignity, even as the system failed him repeatedly. When he died in 1977, the obituaries were brief. Most newspapers didn't run them at all. The Winnipeg Free Press published a 3-paragraph notice. It mentioned his service. It mentioned some of his medals. It didn't mention the farmhouse. It didn't mention that he'd held off 600 Germans for 3 days. It reduced an extraordinary life to a handful of sentences. But in military circles, among the soldiers who knew, the story survived. It was passed down from one generation of Canadian infantry to the next. "Let me tell you about Tommy Prince," sergeants would say to new recruits, and they'd tell the story of the farmhouse, of the 3 days, of the telephone wire repaired in broad daylight while Germans watched. The story grew over time, as all military stories do. Some versions had Prince taking out German patrols with his knife. Others had him sneaking into the German camp at night. The truth was more remarkable than any embellishment. The truth was that Prince didn't need to fight. He just needed to watch, to wait, and to call in precise coordinates while remaining undetected for 3 days. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.